Hey guys, it's Clint. It's good to be back with you again. I have the distinct pleasure this morning of having Ed Honea in the house with us. Welcome, Mayor.
Well, thank you, Clint. It's a pleasure to be here, and
Yeah,
I'm really happy to talk to you about some of the things about the family and about Marana.
yeah. That's what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about the history of Marana. We're going to talk about the Honey family, and then we're going to share part of Ed's story. All these are really impactful in my world, being a part of Marana and getting to know you, and I know your story. And I said to my wife a few weeks ago, I got to tell Ed's story. I got to tell the story of Marana through Ed's eyes. We were talking about your family. Give us a little background on when the Honeys got to Marana and
My grandparents came here in the early 1930s, and they were cotton farmers, and they actually leased a piece of state land in Marana and started the cotton farming business. My granddad originally worked for Freeman Woods, who was a very famous old family in Tucson, at his dairy over on Miracle Mile, and started farming, on weekends and things in Marana. He originally grew crops with water out of the river. Back in the early days, the Santa Cruz River ran a lot more than it does now. Now the water's effluent. And you could gravity flow water out of the river into the farms, which were low, and water the crops. And he started a cotton farm. Eventually, then they got electricity and put in wells and started doing things, but came here to be a cotton farmer.
where'd they come from?
Arkansas.
Arkansas.
Out of my four grandparents, who were all cotton farmers at one time, three from Arkansas and one from Oklahoma.
From the Midwest to
Right.
South, which so many of us did. I got to throw this line out. You've heard me say it. I'm not a native of Arizona, but I got here as quick as I could. And I've been in Marana now 20 years. And I want to thank the Honey family and all the other families that have built this community to what it is today. And we want to go over some of that history and how we got to where we are now. Ed, just as a reference point, has been a leader in this community since, what'd you say a while ago?
Originally, it was elected in 77, served a 2-year term, and then lost. Elected again in 81, served a 2-year term, and lost. The early days of Marana, and I could explain why those things happened as well. Then I got out for 8 years, and a friend of mine in 1991 asked me to run for the council. And I said, I really don't. At that time, I was divorced, and I had 2 children, a son and a daughter living with me, and they needed my attention more than the political world. And she said, well, I'll do the petitions for you. I'll fill out the paperwork. All you got to do is sign it. Well, the long story short is I got elected in 1991, 31 years ago.
Yeah.
And I'm still here.
Yeah.
And I had done 4 years before that, so I've really got about 35 years of
serving the community.
and I love every minute of it. I love the community. My dad went to school here. I went to school here. My children went to school here. My children live out of state, but I have a lot of nieces and nephews of that the next 2 generations. I'm a third of a 5-generation family in Marana that are still going to Marana schools.
Isn't that
still
incredible? 3, third, and 5 generations in this, dating now nearly 100 years. I mean, 90 safely in the 90-year range. Your family's been.
But very interesting, and some interesting things about Marana schools, and I have talked about this to many groups. In 1953, when I started the school, and we didn't have kindergarten back then, it was a very small school system. Every kid in the class looked like me. Now, I'm not saying some weren't better looking, and there were boys and girls and everything else. They all had the same color skin I do. In 1954, a long time ago, the class picture was every shade of the rainbow. Black, white, red, yellow, brown, rich, poor. We were all in school together. And I'm very proud of that.
Yeah.
And when we were going through the 60s and there were riots and there were black schools or there were Hispanic schools or there were this school.
The racial strife that we experienced.
We didn't have that.
Yeah.
And to be honest with you, I don't even remember the first grade. I don't remember ever not going to school, to where all of my friends, without regard to their color or how much money they had or their position in society, we all went to school together.
Yeah.
And it was awesome. I mean, we just loved it. And I'm very proud of Marana doing that back in the day.
You know, I've been here 20 years in Marana for 20 years now. I would say that still holds true today. When you see business owners and people in the community, it's a rainbow of colors and backgrounds. And
if you look at Marana, I said other than the Native American community, Yoan Pueblo, which is owned by the reservation, we don't have communities of different ethnic groups.
Correct.
We really started growing back. My parents started the Honea Heights neighborhood, the first official neighborhood, in 1953. But we all lived together.
Mm-hmm.
You could walk down the Honea Heights neighborhood, the old neighborhood, or some of the newer ones, Gladden Farms, or even Continental Ranch, and knock on 10 doors.
Mm-hmm.
You will find black people, you will find brown people, yellow, red, white, different religions, different factions, young, old, and everything else.
I love that.
We all live together, and we live together in harmony. We don't have a lot of the issues you see maybe in some of the larger cities, and I'm just very proud of that. That's just one of the things that other communities have had to deal with that we don't have a problem with.
You know, I want to say on record, I've said this to you personally. I think I called you during some of this. And this isn't a political statement at all, what I'm getting ready to say. But over the last couple of years, with all the confusion and the things that we've dealt with as a community and as a nation and as a world,
Right.
Your take on it from day one, and I mean this sincerely, and I've told a lot of people this, your take on it is basically the most genuine take that I got from, all of our elected officials, appointed officials, was respect each other's decision as you made your choices for you and your family.
Right.
And I appreciate that, Ed, and I want to go on record saying what I've said to other people. Your leadership during that was huge, especially to a business owner in Marana. You gave me, you actually have no idea and how many people feel this way, because the county was attacking us pretty hard.
Right.
They were going at us really hard, and they may have had their reasons or felt justified, but you gave me a cover that I felt like you had our backs during this, and you didn't take a side. I don't want to suggest that. Is that fair enough to say? You didn't really take a side?
I believe so. And really, if you look at government, all government is important to us. The people in government that are most important to you and your family are the school board,
Mm-hmm.
your town council in Marana, or your city council,
Mm-hmm.
maybe your county board of supervisors, because those men and women have a direct effect on your family.
Exactly.
Do you have a nice park? Do you have good roads?
Do you have safety in the community?
Do you have safety in the community? Do you have good schools?
Yeah.
You know, and that's what's important to you. The national or state things that are happening, the state is somewhat more important because it can affect our community. But a lot of things happening nationally, you look at it and say, wow, that would never happen here. It just wouldn't. And we run a safe community. I look at some of the smash and grabs you see in San Francisco or in New York City. You smash and grab here,
You're getting grabbed.
you're going to jail.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Because we're not just going to say, well, if it's under $500, we'll let you go.
Yeah.
No.
No.
If little Johnny, I tell this story, if little Johnny goes into Circle K and tries to steal a candy bar and heads out the door and gets caught, if that store owner calls the police, we will respond. Now, obviously, little Johnny is not going to jail. Little Johnny's 10 or 12 years old or something like that. But we'll call little Johnny's parents if they're not there with him. And we'll say, hey, this is not acceptable. You got to pay for the candy bar because he's already had it. But we're not giving little Johnny a record, or we're not mistreating them. But we will respond.
Yeah.
And little Johnny knows that if he steals another candy bar, the punishment could be more severe. Now, obviously, you're not going to, incarcerate a child, but you're going to make an impression on them and their parents or grandparents that we will not accept lawlessness. That business, and a lot of it is corporate, but a lot of it's mom and pop's little corner grocery or little corner store or shop. That's how they make their living and feed their family. We're not going to let you steal from them.
And pay their taxes and support the community,
pay their taxes and are good citizens, know.
Yeah.
And you have to have parameters and guidelines within which you live. And if there are not consequences for bad actions, which are happening in a lot of places in our country right now, unfortunately, you're going to get worse actions. And we're just not going to allow that here.
Well, again, I want to thank you and the council as a whole, but you specifically for your take on what we experienced, and I respect that a lot. And I know that wasn't necessarily at that moment maybe the most popular approach to take, especially in the environment that we lived in as far as the community. But you gave me personally, and I know a lot of small business owners, a lot of, I hate to use the word cover, but I felt like you had our backs.
We will respond.
And that was important to me.
And I think you have to maintain things. Our roadways are in pretty good shape.
They are.
And the reasoning is we want to take care of the roadways. If we have potholes and you're dodging potholes, or even if you're running through them and it damages your car eventually, if you're dodging potholes, do you hit somebody on the side of the road, or do you have an accident, or do you... we want our roads to be safe. And we want you to be comfortable in what you're doing. We have an app at the town of Marana for a public works
Recording
app.
that.
And if somebody sees a big pothole, say after a rainstorm, and it washes out some areas, I've had people call me and say, at 9 o'clock in the morning, I put in an app that on Ina Road, on West Ina, there's a big pothole before the bridge. And when I came home from work that afternoon, the pothole was filled and packed. And I really appreciate that. And the person's telling me that. I really appreciate that, too, because it shows that we are attentive to you and what is bothering you.
And if you're from Marana or from the area and you're listening to this, you know that community that we have. I mean, everybody knows everybody. Everybody's kind of related to everybody. If you're not from Marana, this is a unique place. Again, I mentioned I've been here 20 years, but I feel at home. And I have felt that way pretty much once I got here, got around.
Right.
It's got that small town feeling. I can say this about you. I've reached out to you. I've reached out to other leaders in the community. I don't always get the answer I'm looking for, but I've always gotten a response.
Sure.
And you tell me that you get that in basically any other city of this size.
You will get an answer, and if we don't agree with your request, you will get a reason too.
Yeah.
And you may not agree with that
No.
either, but we'll say we're not going to do this because of that. And we'll tell you why we're not responding. And people appreciate an answer.
They do.
You know, another thing about our community is we've always been concerned about the people. And this is just not me trying to play to individuals.
No, I know that.
I'll give you an example. During the pandemic, Tucson and Oro Valley basically shut all their parks. You couldn't even go to the park.
No.
Our parks were open every day. Our personnel went out, park personnel, cleaned the restrooms 2 or 3 times a day, which was more than normal, sprayed them down with disinfectant. We cleaned the playground equipment 2 or 3 times a day, sprayed the slides and the swings down with disinfectant, because we knew that especially the children in our community were at home.
Mm-hmm.
They were not playing with their peers. They were not out getting fresh air and sunshine. They were not running around getting exercise. And we knew that that was really important. And I can't tell you how many calls we got from young families that said, you know, I was able to take my 3 children to the park and play on the swings, or just run around and throw the frisbee or something. And, you know, we asked people to respect each other back then, early days of COVID, and we didn't understand it completely. You know, try to stay 15 or 20 feet away from another family throwing a ball around or throwing the
Right.
frisbee or that type of stuff. But we were thinking about the people, not the politics. And there are people from both parties on our council. There are, you know, younger and older people, men and women. We were concentrating on the people, and we really appreciated. About 2/3 of the town had to work through the pandemic. The men and women in our police department worked every day.
Yeah. Extra some.
And it didn't matter. Our people in our roads department worked every day. We still filled potholes. We still trimmed weeds around intersections. We still did that kind of stuff. And our park and rec people worked every day, and we kept every park open. And as soon as legally we could do it, we opened both of our splash pads, which caters mainly, I'm going to say, to families with children 10 or 12 and younger. A lot of the bigger kids don't go to them. So they had a place to go. And incidentally, they are free to the families. So a young family could take their 2 or 3 little kids out there, get wet, have a little bit of fun. It's out in the wide open. And we tried to stay open because
You did a great job.
our primary service is not to build power for ourselves. Is to provide safety and recreation for the people that live here.
You do a great job. Just for the record, for full disclosure, I don't sleep in Marana. I sleep in Oro Valley, but I live in Marana every day. I'm proud to be a daytime resident of this city.
Right.
And the things that you talked about at home were not there. It broke my heart to go home and see in our little neighborhood park the yellow tape wrapping that. That made me really sad. I'd forgotten that as you were reminiscing about that. I'd forgotten how the difference driving by a park here and people there and enjoying it at a hard time.
I'm not trying to be judgmental.
No.
Some of those other folks may think I'm protecting people from getting this virus or something. And we early on started recognizing that there are many different facets that apply in this equation. And if you look at now, suicide rates are very high among teenagers. And teenage girls are the worst for suicide rate.
Drug abuse, alcohol
Drug abuse
abuse.
is much worse. And we, kind of locked everybody up for 2 years.
Yeah.
We tried to do everything we could. I'll even give you another example. We did close our senior center for about a year and a half during the COVID, because obviously people that were passing away from this disease a lot of times were older and had medical problems and things. But we had 3 or 4 personnel that worked in the senior center. Well, what are we going to do with them? We've closed our center, and we did close one thing, and it was because if the average age is 70 plus, and a lot of these people have health problems, we don't want them getting COVID. We took those 4 people, and we provided child care for our staff members.
That's awesome. I didn't know.
During
know
the
that.
COVID. And if you're a young woman police officer and you've got a couple kids, and we have a lot of officers where the young lady and the young man are married together and work for our police department. We have several couples like that. The child care centers weren't open.
Right.
COVID.
Right.
So we need our police to work to keep everybody safe. Criminals don't care about COVID. So what we would do, you're that young officer, say a young lady officer, you bring your 2 kids to work, and our park and rec people watch those
That is
kids
cool.
while you were on shift.
That is cool.
And we did that, and of course they were outside at the park.
Right.
We still made them wear masks if it was required and all that kind of stuff. But it gave our park and rec people a chance to, be part of this, the answer, not the problem.
Yeah, part of the solution.
And it applied to park and rec and roads people, because all of those people, about 2/3 of our employees, had worked through the pandemic. And a lot of them didn't have, even they were saying you can't take your kid to grandma's because if your kid gets COVID, grandma gets it and grandma dies.
Right.
And, we learned better later, but at first we didn't know. And you'd have, the young man on the road crew or the young lady that's a police officer saying, I know I have to come to work, but I got kids.
Yeah.
Well, bring your kids to work and we'll watch them.
I did not.
And we didn't charge them either. I mean, we just watched.
I did. I had not heard this story.
So,
yet.
I mean, that kind of shows that we're a family.
Yeah.
And we do understand. I hate to ramble, but I mean, it's kind of during COVID, as many people as we could, we allowed to work from home. And the legal department, the finance department, a lot of the administrative department people work from home because they could do what they needed to do. They worked on a computer all day if they were in the office.
But it's kind of hard to patch a hole from home.
You can't patch a hole.
You can't police.
Or mow the grass at a park.
Yeah.
Or be the men and women in our police department that have to respond to an accident or a home break-in or something like that. But we have since told all our employees, you got to come back to work. And we've lost a couple employees because of that. Our philosophy, and this I'll give Mr. Rosema and Patty and Herb and John who just ran and got reelected. Thank you, Marana. Credit for that. We are public servants.
Correct.
You can't serve the public in your pajamas at home, even if you're doing your job.
Yeah.
Because if you work in finance and somebody comes in and wants to ask a taxing or an impact fee problem or wants to understand about their business license, it's a lot easier if you have a face there to deal with than somebody on a computer trying to walk you through what you're doing. So we've had all our people come back to work. And
everybody's back now.
Right.
We're back
and we've done something else that's innovative. We're looking at going to, we're saying that we need people to work 40 hours to do whatever their task is. We have them work what we call the 9/8. 4 days a week, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, you work 9 hours. Friday, you work 8. The next work, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, you work 9 hours. You have banked 8 hours.
Mm-hmm.
You take Friday off,
Mm-hmm.
and you get every other weekend, you get a 3-day weekend. Yet you've still come in and worked 40 hours.
Put the time in.
And so we're kind of working on a program like that, to where people do get more time with their family or their spouse or whatever. And it might not be the weekend. I mean, police or park personnel may work the weekend and be off Tuesday and Wednesday, but that one week you're going to get Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday off, because, you know, we've done that with PD for a long time, 10-hour shifts. So they work 4 days a week anyway. And that works well. But there's enough of them that you overlap and you make it work. But for parks and streets and administration and stuff like that, we want you to be in the building or in it, the facility, wherever it is. We have several buildings. But we want you to work 40 hours. But we're going to get you a 3-day weekend every other weekend.
How many employees are employed by the town of Marana?
406 or something like that.
406.
And we don't always have a full contingency. It's really hard to get employees right now.
Hey, so real quick, and we're going to get towards the end of our first run through here, but when you first started back in, would you say 1977? How many people worked for the town of Marana then? Just to kind of get a number of what we've done over the last 45 years. And that was the first year that Marana was actually incorporated. It was in 1977.
Marana had been there since about 1898, some kind of a settlement, either the railroad or farming or whatever.
So you served on the first council?
First elected council.
First elected a council.
Which was about 3 months after we were incorporated. One of the 7 council members decided to be the magistrate. Harry Hansen's his name. And that left a vacancy. And there were several of us that ran, and I won that seat. So I was on the first elected council. Yeah.
And how many people were employed by the town of Marana, you think, at that time?
I'm going to say about 5 or 6. Our planning director was Dr. George Leamy, who worked for free. Our building inspector and kind of plans examiner worked out of his own truck, and he kept the maps and papers in his truck. That was his office. And we basically bought him a tank of gas. He was a retired individual, and I can't think of a name right now. It'll come to me at 2 o'clock. I'll call you tonight.
We'll plug it in.
And a tank of gas and
$25
$25 a week. He was semi-retired, didn't need to make a lot of money. So a lot of the employees worked for free. We bought our first 2 squad cars from state surplus. They were Ford Fairlanes with about 200,000 miles on them. We got some free paint from the military base and painted them green. Green squad cars. I could probably find you a picture.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to see physical evidence of that.
Our dispatch had one person. She was the office manager, the secretary, and the dispatcher. And it was a CB radio. Hello, good buddy.
Yeah.
we didn't have 2 nickels to run together. Yeah. Our first town budget was $40,000.
And what is this year?
$233 million.
Yeah. So how much was the first one?
40,000.
40,000.
$233 million.
In 45 years.
And about 5 paid employees. We had a town clerk, which you were required to have by law. We had 3 police officers. and I can't even remember who the other person.
What was the population then? What was the
Right around 1,500. You had to have 1,500 to incorporate. And we may have cheated a little on that. It was probably 12 or 13, but the county was very friendly toward us at the time. It was Bud Walker and Katie Dusenberry and a bunch of those people, and they allowed us to incorporate.
1977. I was 1 year out of high school in 1970, first year of college. Before we wrap up though with this first episode, I want to go back to your parents, your grandparents. In the early 30s, they moved here from Arkansas and Oklahoma,
Right.
and they started farming and they started renting property. But there's a story that comes shortly after that, and it's a hot topic in the most recent election. And that's water. There's a big, and as we live in the desert, there is always a water concern here. But your parents or grandparents were heavily involved.
My grandparents, like I said, my grandfather worked for Freeman Woods, who was a famous name in Tucson. And he owned a dairy over on Miracle Mile. And my granddad worked at the dairy. But he got the lease on some state land in Marana at Sanders and the Santa Cruz River. And he used to irrigate the crops with water out of the river because it would gravity flow down out of the river, and he would dam up part of the river, and the river ran more frequently back then. It wasn't dammed up so much in Mexico and different places, because that river runs north. It's one of only two that run north in the U.S., I think. And he would irrigate with some of that water. And then eventually, the original house they built didn't have running water. And they got electricity after the fact. But then they eventually got power where they could irrigate.
We're talking 30s and 40s
in
now.
the 30s, crops. My granddad was on Trico Electric's board in the 1940s or something like that. But started growing cotton. They had a family of 8. My youngest would be my aunt, Beverly, actually drowned in the irrigation ditch that runs along Moore Road there right by the Honea Heights neighborhood. And back in the day, she was the youngest of 8 children and somehow got away from, mom, and older kids help watch the little ones too, and got out to that ditch, and by the time they found her, she had drowned.
But they started the first water,
my parents, this is much later, started the first really potable water company, the Honea Water Company, in the Honea Heights neighborhood. Because my dad took that land. My mother and father had bought that piece of land with the help of my maternal grandfather. His name was Steele, Steele. And my dad was going to farm, my parents. And then they decided they didn't want to farm. So they decided to subdivide. And that was the very first neighborhood subdivision in Marana. Period.
And what time?
About 1953.
Okay.
Well, if you subdivide property, every lot's not going to drill a well. And of course, the lots were bigger. Most of the lots were 1/3 of an acre or something like that. Every lot had a septic tank, which was legal at that time in the county. And a lot of them over there still have septics, they haven't switched over. And my dad took a water well there by the town complex in North Marana, the old town complex, and turned it into a potable water company. He didn't have pressure tanks and all that kind of stuff. There was a cement building there with a tank that was about 15 or 18 feet high, and it had like a 3,000-gallon metal tank on top of it. Well, my dad's well would pump water into that tank, and the pressure for the first 10 or 15 houses in Honea Heights was gravity flow weight pressure out of that tank. They didn't have a pressure system. Ran on gravity flow.
That is crazy.
And that was the first potable water company. He sold that company years ago. I want to say about late 80s or around
So
1990
it
to the
stayed-
town of Marana.
So 40 years,
Yeah.
roughly, that they had that. Now you can see why I want to tell these stories, because the more we start digging and unearthing and talking about stuff, I mean,
Well, I apologize to you
these
if I
folk-
ramble.
no,
but
these folks-
If something comes
No,
to mind
these-
and I think it's interesting,
I think
I'm
it's
going to
so
tell you
cool
about it.
because they took in this case, it was your grandparents and your parents created a town that you now represent as
Well,
the-
we had a town. They created a neighborhood.
they've created a community.
Most of the town was either kids from Silver Bell Mine, the El Paso gas pumping station, and every large farmer, including my granddad, might have a house for themselves, and then they had labor, almost like labor camps.
Right.
And sometimes they weren't even buildings; they were tents, or people would just
Lean to.
they would come in and put up a little shack or a tent. They would work during the farming year, and they'd be gone the rest of the year. And the next year, they'd come back and they'd work again. It was like, traveling labor force.
We're going to add, as we do this, pictures and different reference points to see this. But in my mind, as you tell these stories, these are cool because I think back. I mean, my parents didn't create a town, or my grandparents, but yet in many respects, some of the things you talk about, I can see my parents doing, my grandparents doing, and the fact that they moved out here in pretty. I mean, we love it here. It's lush here, but it's not. It's kind of a harsh environment, and especially in the summer.
Right.
And make this sustainable and last. Now, what we're talking about is 100 years, and growing and prospering in one of the most desirable places in the Southwest to move to. If you don't believe that, look at our 20% increase in population in the last 4 years. So to get these stories out is, for me, is really cool. I mean, I love it. I love hearing these stories, and I'm sure other people will as well.
And the Honea Heights neighborhood became really the first mixed racial neighborhood in the Marana area. Like I said, a lot of farmers had their home in a labor camp that might be people of color.
Mm-hmm.
And different things. But in the Honea Heights neighborhood, it didn't matter if you were Hispanic. And later on, there were a couple black families that came and bought
That's so
parcels
cool.
and moved into the family. And this is way before the riots of the 60s and all that kind of stuff,
Did you notice they moved into the family? Literally.
And we are a big family.
Yeah.
We're just a family.
We are.
And do we do everything perfectly? No.
Not
But-
even close sometimes.
But do we really try to accommodate everybody
yeah.
and every demographic, and rich or poor, regardless of color or religion or political party or whatever? And we've all tried to live together, and we do a pretty good job.
I'd say we do. I'm proud to be a part of this
We
community.
do a pretty good job.
Ed, it's been fun. I'm looking forward to
Well,
digging a lot. We're going to peel this onion so far back.
Well, if you'd like to, eventually, Clint, if you want to get into specifics, say the schools,
I do.
or the farming,
I do.
or things, and you want to work at that. My dad worked at Pinal Air Park when he was a young man. It's now Marana, or used to be Marana Air Park. It's now Pinal Air
Right.
Park. Because that was a military training base during World War II. And then my dad's a veteran, but after he got back, he worked for the fire department out there for
I
several
want to get into
years.
that.
And it's very
Because someone had to
interesting.
create those things. They weren't here.
Yeah,
They're here
They were
now.
created, and even our Marana Airport, and I could give you some history on that. It was a training base for military during World War II. It was out in the middle of nowhere. They paved this big field. They practiced parachute jumping. They practiced take off and
we saw
takeoff
him.
and landings.
We
I'm
saw
sorry.
him this morning on our way in. We
Right.
saw 7 or 8 of them
But
jump
there's
out
so
of a
much
plane.
history. That airport started out as a military airport. Eventually, and it was out of service.
Are we talking in the 30s then? In the 30s,
yeah,
40s?
probably or around 1940-ish
Yeah.
or so, training military
Yeah.
people for World War II. And then it was abandoned for many years. I could tell you about taking my car out there and running across the airport chasing rabbits at night.
Yeah.
And then the county took it over, and it became kind of a little local airfield. And it has evaluated today, within the next year or two, we're going to have a tower there, and we can land planes as big as a 737. I don't want to, but I could give you a whole podcast
Hey,
on the
and
airport.
you know what? I want to do that. I want to cover that for sure.
So there's a lot of things that I have a lot of history on. I'd love for the people in the community to be aware of.
Well, you know what? That's
but we don't have enough time.
Well,
to do
yeah,
all
not
that.
today. But that's why when it hit me, and I was at home that day, and I walked by, and my wife was sitting in the family room, and I just pointed it at her, and I'm like, I'm going to talk to Ed. I wanted to tell the story. It was just always kind of been there. This is a cool story. A kid growing up in the Midwest, as a young person, I always thought about the Rio Grande and growing up with cacti and the whole thing. And now I live here. It's really kind of like almost surreal. And as I got to know you and know the community and be involved in the community, I'm a history guy to begin with. So anything that's going to take me back and show how we got from where we got to where we are now is always of interest. And I'm certain there are numerous people in this community and beyond.
Well, we
that want to hear
started
these
about
stories.
600 AD with the Hohokam, the people who were gone. And at that time, the Santa Cruz was a live river, way before modern Marana.
And keep in mind what Ed said, it's flowing south and north, which
and
again,
it used
I think,
to flow all the time. It's been dammed up in Mexico, kind of like the Colorado
Right.
has been in Arizona and Nevada
Yeah.
and stuff. But people have lived in this valley forever. There are places where there are pottery shards and bowls and different things in this community. And I could tell you some about that. When my brother and I were younger, we used to go out and dig for those. It was legal. We weren't breaking the law at the time.
Yeah.
And I gave most of the collection, even the ones I found, to my brother, but he has bowls and matatis and arrowheads that were obtained legally.
Yeah.
And, of course, now they don't allow you to disrupt that, and I agree with that. Those
Right.
are sacred lands.
Right.
But at the time, we weren't trying to hurt anybody. We were curious.
Well, I remember as a kid growing up in a rural area in southern Illinois. I mean, every time the farmers plowed, there'd be arrowheads and different things. I mean, the Native Americans lived throughout, especially if there was places that had, water and places to grow
we had
stuff.
water.
And we had those things
And,
too.
Juan Bautista de Anza
So,
followed the Santa Cruz River because you had water for the people. You had water for the cattle and the horses and everything else. They actually followed the Santa Cruz River, on up into Mexico and different places because there was water here. And if in the desert, if you got a water source, you stay pretty close to it.
yeah.
And of course, the Native Americans farm with the water. And certain areas around Continental Ranch and different areas, a lot of it where they could gravity flow water out of the river at certain times of the year. The Native Americans grew corn and different things here
Masa.
literally hundreds of years ago.
Yeah. I think we go back.
600
I think-
AD,
I
3,000 years
yeah,
ago.
Yeah.
They were growing crops here because some of the burial bowls have corn in them
Yeah. Isn't that crazy?
and different things. But
And yet it set almost had not changed by time for almost all those years till the last.
well, they say who were the
150
first
years.
farmers in Marana?
Yeah.
Well, The Hohokam were the
yeah,
first farmers in Marana,
3,000
600
years,
AD.
yeah, 3,000 years ago they were here, and then didn't really change that much till your grandparents showed up in the 30s.
And my granddad gravity flowed water when he first started farming cotton out here. And then Edwin Post started CMID and Squirtero water users. And I tell people I'm very good friends with the Post family in North Marana, and John Post, our vice mayor. But it was a different Post family.
Mm-hmm.
But then they brought in electricity and they started pumping water and formed the water district that made Marana a phenomenal farming community.
Marana, just touching on water, the way it's been explained to me, Marana, as far as water goes, we've got a lot of water.
And that would be another podcast.
And that's another
And I could
podcast.
go into extreme detail on that.
And we are going to talk about that
Our water table
because
has gone up 150 feet in North Marana in the last 40 years.
isn't that crazy?
And I can explain why. But that's a teaser for the next
For the next one. Hey, we're going to wrap this up. It's been great having you on, Mayor. Thank you, Ed, so much.
I
it's
love
my
this
distinct-
community and its people.
Yeah,
And you know, a community is not the area; it's the people that live in it.
Amen. Thank you.
You're very welcome.
We're going to cut right there.